Thank you, members. If you could find your seats, and we'll reconvene for the rest of the afternoon session. We'll probably end up having one more break, but
You'll take your own break.
Nancy, ever the taskmaster, says no.
No break for you.
So, the next portion of our meeting, we're going to talk about the performance of the Sadowski Act programs. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Muller, and we're behind tab 4.
4 and then 5.
4 and then 5. So this will be for a bit the Nancy Muller Show, and we
Hopefully not too long.
we appreciate all her hard work in putting together these materials for us. So, Nancy, you're recognized.
Thank you. What I want to do is really, I don't want to do a presentation as much as I want to do an orientation to the materials. Most of what's in here is what you requested, various ones of you requested at the last meeting. Behind tab 4 is something that Jamie Ross, who is the Sadowski Coalition Facilitator, among other roles that she has, put together for you all. Representative Miller had asked that she come in and give a presentation on the Sadowski Act, kind of the background of the Sadowski Act. Jamie's up in Michigan making a presentation there. I guess it was, oh well, I called her too late. So she provided certainly more than I asked for, but she provided some history on this. One of the things that she and I talked about as we quote-unquote reminisced on page, so first of all, on page 2 of this, I'm not going to go through this whole thing. You can certainly either have read it already or can read it. Some of you have heard about, and you may not know the history about the fact that Miami-Dade has its own surtax program. Miami-Dade got a local option for a surtax back in 1985, before the Sadowski Act was created and the state and local government housing trust funds were created. So that occurred before the big state program approach. Another thing I wanted to just let you know about, on page 3 of her information behind tab 4, under the Sadowski programs, she includes ship, sail, and catalyst. We also have the Homeownership Assistance Program, which we'll talk about a little bit in a little while. And we also include, Florida Housing includes the Pre-Development Loan Program, or PLP, which is part of our evaluation in the next section. In that first paragraph under that Sadowski program section, it says, the state is limited to no more than 5% of the funds for administration. In particular, so the SHIP program allows local governments under certain circumstances up to 10% for admin purposes. Florida Housing doesn't take any of that admin for its own use. And in fact, for a number of years, for over 10 years, I believe, Florida Housing has not taken even anything of this 5% for admin. Instead, we have used, we charge fees. We act like a bank. We have interest paid on interest. We charge fees for compliance. We, pay our credit underwriters, or really the developers pay the credit underwriters to do credit underwriting, et cetera, in order that we don't have to take this 5% and that it gets used for affordable housing. So you can ask more questions about that. I'll between us, we'll answer them to the best of our ability. I just wanted you to know that. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this. The one other thing I wanted to say about this was that several times over the Sadowski Act's history from '92 to today, there have been there's been legislative interest for various reasons in looking at the Sadowski Act programs, looking at Florida Housing Finance, but in particular looking at the Sadowski Act. And one in particular that Jamie spent some time talking about was on pages 4 and 5. In '03, I'm sorry, '03 and '04, I guess I'm thinking about. In 2003, Speaker Byrd appointed a House Select Committee to look at the Sadowski Act programs. I think one of the things that I've seen occur here in Florida, and I also have seen it at the national level to some extent, is as a program, as a housing program gets older, the question comes up from folks who come in later, how can that program, is that program still working for us? And that's a really good question to ask. It's appropriate. Sometimes there's a belief that how could it be working well for us? It's old, and surely it was there to take care of old problems, and now we have new and different problems. So that is one of the things that we've, in the Sadowski Act, under tab 5, we've looked at the flexibility of the Sadowski Act programs to be able to respond to today's situation, not just whatever was going on in 1992 when it was created. So under Speaker Byrd, this House Select Committee, and I think Jamie actually included a copy of that final report in here, which ultimately I think there was some suspicion of the programs in the beginning, and I think there might have been an interest in the trust funds as well. But ultimately, the committee came around and said, these programs are working well and working for whatever the current needs are and should be maintained. I want to move to tab 5 now. Sure.
Yeah, sure. Senator?
Okay, yeah.
Senator Rich?
I was just wondering, if, obviously, we're going to look at Sadowski as a recommendation to hopefully urge the money to be spent for what purpose it was intended. But I'm really also concerned about the seed trust fund, because that's $75 million, and that's on page 5 where you were, referring to, that is taken off the top now for economic development, and one of the eligible uses is supposed to be affordable housing, which to my knowledge, it's not really used for that. So I'm wondering if we could take a look at it, at least maybe, and, we don't have to make a decision today or anything, but take a look at it to see if that is, something we might like to suggest being changed, that it come back and be used for affordable housing, since it's coming from the
What would you
Sadowski.
like for us to bring to you? What
Well,
information do you need, I guess?
probably I don't have a list of exactly everything that this is being used for, but it does
Okay.
say that it's one of the
Is that what you're
uses.
in-
it
Would you
says
be
that-
interested in seeing what it's been used for?
Well, that would be probably helpful,
Okay,
yeah.
great.
And,
Uh-huh.
but
I don't-
again, my sense is that it's being taken away from the Sadowski, from the Housing Trust Fund. And so it should be used for housing, for affordable housing. And every year, $75 million just comes off the top.
Right. And we can get that information for you, Senator, and I know we can also include whether or not the seed trust fund was swept, because I
Exactly.
believe it was.
Yes, which I believe it was too, yes.
Exactly. Okay. Anything else on that before I move on to tab 5? Okay, thank you. So there were, at last meeting, there were a number of individual or sort of separate requests for information related to the trust funds. And in addition, as I recall, Mayor Messam asked for us to do an evaluation of the performance of the programs under the trust funds with the same general intent of, are they working well, or are there things that we need to do to recommend changes to make them work better? So I just want to go through kind of the key documents in here in case you haven't had a chance to look at them, so that we're all kind of on the same page and allows you to ask any questions. The first document is called a Historical Financial Summary of the State Local Government Trust Funds. Here, all you have in as simple a format as we could come up with is year by year from the first year that there were collections into those trust funds, what the collections were, what the appropriations were, if there was some sort of sweep, how much was it? And then there were a few years where we had a cap on the trust funds. It was only one year that there was funding actually that was above that cap. there in 2007-08, so that 46 million is that cap sweep that year. And then as Commissioner Rich just talked about, the 75 million starting in 12-13, which was goes over to seed. And what you don't have there is you don't have the detail of how much, if any, of the seed trust fund money was swept, but we'll get you that information. So, so you can, and then there's some notes at the bottom. I have a fabulous colleague. We both have a fabulous colleague, our controller, who keeps extraordinarily detailed information on this type of stuff that we could go into probably ad nauseum for you, detail on some of this. I'm not sure we could, but she could certainly. So any questions you have about this? So I'm just going to keep going. If you've got a question, if you don't understand something on a page, I'll try to answer it. And then that gives you then I'll sort of turn it back over to you and you can figure out where to go with it. On the next page, you were interested in understanding how much funding has gone into the programs from the trust fund appropriations over time. And so this one's the dock, stamp tax, and other appropriations to Sadowski programs since inception. So one of the things that's important to understand is that in the early years of the Sadowski programs, when Florida Housing Finance was being appropriated funding out of the trust funds, most of the time in the early years, the board of directors, Florida Housing's board of directors, was and still has the authority to then allocate, not the SHIP funds. The SHIP funds came out of the local government trust fund, and it went out according to the statutory proportional, funding requirements to those folks. But out of the State Housing Trust Fund, the board then allocated the funds across the SAIL program, HAP, the Homeownership Assistance Program, PLP, and Catalyst, et cetera, whatever, sort of the programs in Sadowski. The legislature gave that authority to the board, and so the board made those decisions, and they flexed from year to year based on the market, the need, in the programs, how fast the money was moving, let's say in the Homeownership Assistance Program, and maybe we could take a little, put a little bit less in. The pre-development loan program, which has become more of a revolving loan program, the board hasn't needed to put money into that fund for a number of years, and the like. So when you see this list on this page, some of the funding, let's say the first item, the first program under the State Housing Trust Fund is SAIL, $677 million. A portion of that money, the legislature in proviso language said has to go to SAIL, and a portion of that money was allocated by the board, as I said, typically in the early years. The last few years, the legislature has been more interested in telling us, here's where your money's going to go. I'd say, let's see, last year and this year, it was just a few $1 million that the board was able to allocate and did so. So anyway, just for your information. So you can see under the State Housing Trust Fund, programs that you're used to seeing. You may be confused by the third item there called home. That I was going to put there match funding. In the old days, the federal home program, still requires match. Florida Housing used to use a portion of its State Housing Trust Fund money to match the home funds we got per the federal requirement. We were still using it for housing. We put that, we don't take care of that requirement that way anymore. So that wasn't money that, anyway, I'll just stop there. We used to have, a few of you've made reference to the Guarantee Fund, an old program that is just about worn out now. In the old days, debt service was paid out of the State Housing Trust Fund over many years to that. The Catalyst Training and Technical Assistance Program. There's also the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, which is managed by the Schimbrick Center for Housing Studies, that has gotten funding over the years to provide free access to housing data online. And you've heard Ann Ray speak to us at the first meeting. Some of the data she has as a result of that clearinghouse. Special hurricane funding over time, that's just all blended together here, just kind of thrown in together. Extremely low income and special needs funding, a few different kinds of things over time, appropriated kinds of things. SHIP funding, the legislature a few years ago stopped being, it really riled up my sense of like organization and order, because SHIP's supposed to come out of the local government trust fund, and you know, and the state programs come out of the state housing, but the legislature has, in its wisdom, not worried so much about that recently. So some SHIP has come out of the State Housing Trust Fund, but you'll see below in the local government section, most of the SHIP over time has come out of the local fund. Funding for SHIP compliance monitoring. Florida Housing did take some admin dollars in the, you know, I said in the old days, we took admin dollars before we quit taking those. That's what that administration funding is about. And then under the local government housing trust fund, you've got mainly SHIP in the last few years out of the local government trust fund. We've got homeless funding coming out, going over mainly to DCF, but there's also some training money that goes to DEO to administer. Again, some SHIP compliance monitoring, Catalyst, the clearinghouse. There was kind of an agreement back in the early 2000s that the local government, like local governments need data as well as state government needs data, so there was going to be a split between the two trust funds to support the clearinghouse. Again, hurricane funding. This one time, it was actually a 2-year pilot that didn't work really very well, the Community Workforce Housing Innovation Pilot. Again, sale, and then, you know, some miscellaneous. Now, the other thing is that because of the National Attorney General settlement that Florida was part of, one year we received there was no funding out of the trust funds to Florida Housing. All of that funding was appropriated through this settlement. And you can see the amounts there that were funded. We got some special funding. That was, I think that was the first year of our developmental disabilities grant. We got one-time homeless grant funding. FC is foreclosure counseling. Actually, it should be F counseling instead of FC counseling. Foreclosure counseling.
Foreclosure counseling.
Right, funding. And then in the last couple of years, this Affordable Housing Guarantee Fund, which had its heyday many years ago, and at the recession, actually before the recession, or right as we were entering the recession, Florida Housing's Board of Directors stopped doing new guarantees. It wasn't really needed anymore. There were funds, as funds were repaid to the guarantee fund by developments, we worked with the legislature to basically reallocate that funding, and mainly that's gone to sale funding. So this is, even though the bottom two sections are really not out of the trust funds, we thought it was important to provide you with that information, but it gives you a sense of the funding and the percentages of the appropriations, and I would say also board allocations that have occurred over time. On the next page, there was a question at the last meeting about what the amount of housing that has been foregone due to the sweeps over time. So this is a calculation, and it is simply, I mean, really, it is a calculation. It is not, you know, what we did was we figured out how much, you know, we totaled up how much had been swept over time, and then we reallocated that money based on the percentages that had been allocated to each of these big key programs, you know, figured out how much had been, per unit had been put into those, per unit had been put in by those programs over time, and then did this is a very quick and dirty estimate of units foregone. So a total of 167,000 units, most of those with SHIP. You know, and one of the main ways that SHIP has been used over time is down payment assistance, and then small amounts of rehab funding. You'll see the sale funds, 17,000 per unit all years. That's all years. The amount of sale today is higher. I think, and further on in here, you'll see funding amounts for sale, like average of about 45,000. Obviously, it's increased over time. You've been hearing some talk today from the rental developers about, you know, the increasing gap over time. So this 17,000 is not what we could do if we had that money today. It's what we could have done over some period of time. Again, very crude, very crude. And then from there, this gets into an evaluation of the performance of the Sadowski Act programs. And I can either, it wasn't my plan to go through every single one of these as much as, unless you would like me to, as much as to just give you kind of an orientation. So there's a little bit of program description information, a little bit of, you know, how does the program get funded, you know, noting in all cases where program income is received, that it goes back into the program. And so if a sale loan's repaid or interest is received for that loan, those funds are recirculated into the program. And then this is really simple stuff, and it's really all I had time to do before this meeting. So you may decide that you want some greater detail, and that's fine. If you want greater detail, we can certainly, you know, put that together, but it's a good start, I think. So in each case for each of these programs, you have this little performance section, and, you know, so you've got information on how much was appropriated or allocated either by Florida Housing's board or the legislature over time. That ties back into a, you know, previous page. If there's program income, that amount of program income, the total number of units financed, and in this case, like with sale, well, even with SHIP, if those units don't have affordability restrictions anymore, we still counted them because it's over time, what was the production. And then the leveraging amount. So what other funding were we able to bring in, typically federal funding, certainly with sale, that was able to be leveraged over time. And remember from our conversations, that mainly is the bond funding and bond financing and the 4% non-competitive housing credits. And then just a little bit of start on sort of how sale has been able to be flexible over time. And, you know, I did not put this in here, but over time, Florida Housing has worked with stakeholders and the legislature to think about, you know, as times change, what do we need to do in statute to keep the program fresh and workable? And so like one of the things some years ago when we started doing more preservation, rehab of existing housing, we realized that the statute was set up only to do what's called substantial rehabilitation. So it's with the definition of basically over half of the value of the property, you know, I mean, you couldn't do anything moderate. You couldn't do any smaller type of rehab on properties. And we were finding that we had a big need for kind of more moderate rehab. So we went to the legislature and said, we proposed that we broaden how we can use this so that we're not only using sale in situations where you're, you know, knocking half the units down or you're gutting the units. We don't want to wait until you get to the point where you're gutting. We want to fix them before that. And there are many other examples of that. So here you've got in each case with these programs, you know, a beginning sense of the flexibility of the program. And we could probably flesh these out if you're interested. You know, I was thinking about, I don't remember which one it was of you at the last meeting saying, well, some of what you've written here sort of helps to write our final report. So I was thinking about that. We'll pick and choose what we want to use here, if any of it. So I've got a page for sale, one for the homeownership assistance program, which you'll remember David Westcott talked about at our last meeting. You know, what we've gotten back in program income on that, and you know, the total units over time. There's a page and a little bit more on the SHIP program. We've divided that into rental and homeownership because that is, of course, both programs. Today, the SHIP program still, you know, the statute says 65% of SHIP funds must go to homeownership. And you've heard a number of people say, we want more flexibility. Right now, local governments are using more than 80%, more like 85% of their funds for home ownership. There is a lot more flexibility available in statute than local governments are taking. So, and initially, I think SHIP was sort of seen as the home ownership program, SAIL was kind of seen as the rental program, and I'm not saying that shouldn't change, but I think that's where that came from, that whole concept.
Nancy,
So-
can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
I mean, so we've heard that in many counties, they get $350,000. So if they used anything towards rental, it would be this much, and you can't, I'm sure the gap on whatever is needed in those communities is much bigger than what they're permitted to use SHIP for. Is it because to use a portion of it towards rental, they just can't find a deal where that makes any benefit? I don't know if I asked the question
I'm sure that that's
intelligently.
part of it, but I believe from what we've heard that the bigger problem is that if you give down payment assistance as an example, or you go in and rehab a property that you've income qualified, you go in there, you do the work, and then you're done. You do not have to monitor that property to make sure that the residents who move into the rental unit over time, over, let's say, 15 years or whatever the compliance
Gotcha.
period is, and the smallest local governments don't have staff for that.
Okay.
We have worked over time to change the statute so that it says, if you have another program, let's say Florida Housing Sale Program, and the local government puts in some of their rental program, that Florida Housing's compliance monitoring takes over, and the local doesn't have to worry about it. But if you want to do a little bit of rental without Florida Housing's funding, now you got to monitor that unit for a period of time. And I don't, that's an area that we've heard is a barrier, so.
Just to follow up, is there a percentage that must be used for new construction?
No.
So,
75% of this is an overlapping requirement. 75% of the funds, SHIP funds, must be used for construction-related activities, but it can be rehab or new construction,
okay.
but nothing for new construction in statute.
Although you hear there is all the time.
Yeah, I have heard that, so that's why I
Now,
was
it
asking.
may be that the local government plan focuses on new construction, but that's up to the local government, how they,
But it's not, a-
and the residents' comments to that plan, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
The public process, yeah. So there's a section on SHIP, there's a little section on PLP. Again, the pre-development loan program in some ways is Florida Housing's riskiest program, not from a dollar point of view, but it's an entry point for new or emerging organizations or local governments or public housing authorities who want to get into development, and instead of, we require in our construction programs that a developer have experience. Well, how do you get experience if you can't come in for the program funding? It's a catch-22. The pre-development loan program is a way to come in as an emerging organization and get up to $750,000 today in funding that can be used for site acquisition and also pre-development activities. Free technical assistance is paired with that. And Florida Housing gets a development plan that is built by that nonprofit and that technical assistance provider that comes to the board approves it. There's credit underwriting on the land if there's site acquisition. But what you will see under the performance is that if you don't think of the context of the PLP program as being a place for an emerging organization to come and decide whether they have a great idea, they maybe even have some land, and they want to build housing. The PLP program has been a place where a lot of organizations have figured out, you know what, we don't want to do this. This is not our thing. Now we're learning about what goes into this. We don't have the stamina. We don't have the people internally. We don't want to hire people to do this, whatever it is. In some cases, in many cases, organizations come in through PLP and they pair up then with a for-profit developer. They find, with some good technical assistance, from our providers who are under contract with Florida Housing. And so you'll see that over time, we've made 139 loans over many years, so it's a small program. We've also, though, had 136 applications that didn't proceed with funding. In other words, they never closed their loans with us, their PLP loans with us, either because they decided they didn't want to go forward, they couldn't get construction funding, market conditions. We certainly had we had nonprofits fail during the recession. Folks, just like we had businesses fail that didn't necessarily have capital to weather the situation. So we can talk more about the PLP program, if you're interested. And then the final program is the Affordable Housing Catalyst Program, the Training and Technical Assistance Program. This one's a little different because what I did was we collected information on the kinds of assistance and how many units of that assistance have been provided over time. And that's been a great program to help us move in new directions. So foreclosure counseling and getting the SHIP local governments sort of thinking about and trained up on how to think about foreclosure assistance, for instance, versus, just anything. And then the final thing in this tab is the realtors had worked with us a little bit a few years ago, as well as FSU, to do an economic analysis, and I thought it was just on SHIP until Danielle sent this to me. Yeah, the SHIP and sale funds by county. Now, this is just a little summary. We can certainly provide, I think the link is provided here on page 1 of this. I was going to do some economic impact for each of these programs and realized really ran out of time, and sort of you all can decide how important that is to do, but included this information. I think the Florida Realtors data is a 10-year snapshot. I think it's from 06 to 16, if I recall correctly. So anyway, so that's for your information. But, again, we put this tab 4 and tab 5 together because you all had said, yeah, let's look at Sadowski. After all, it undergirds, everything we're here talking about. And so I will stop there. I have one question,
Yep. Senator Rich?
Thank you. Do we have, or could we get a breakdown of how much each county has given in to the Sadowski Trust Fund?
I can see if we can get that.
Okay.
I
would
don't
be
know, but I'll
very
see.
interested.
That
in-
sounds like it
in
would
knowing.
be dock stamps by county.
Dock stamps by county is what it would
Would that
be.
be-
It would
does that make
be,
Well, it's
yeah.
not as simple as that.
It's not as
because
simple,
it's,
right.
It's because we don't, these two trust funds take a portion of those dock
Yeah,
stamps and.
right.
But I will, if
Just
the
ask.
answer is yes, then we can
Yeah,
provide it,
yeah.
yeah. I probably can.
Yeah, we're looking,
'Cause we-
started the Florida tax
We
handbook.
know, we can look at, I can look at individually, because I have the list of Broward County over the last 5
Okay.
years to find out how much more we put in than we got back, which is around $80 million. So I'm just curious, though, about, comparisons relative to all similar sized counties, whatever.
Right.
With the exception
And I
of
think you'll
possibly
see-
Dade, which has its own situation.
Yeah, yeah, and Senator, I think you'll see some interesting, things there. You got somebody like Monroe County that has obviously some of the highest real estate prices in the state. You're gonna probably see, and they're technically a small county, I believe they have less than 100,000 residents, and they aren't, I don't believe they're growing as of the last census. So, I think you'll see, they are probably donor counties because of their simple fact that, with every real estate transaction, they're paying a lot more of a dock stamp than, the average, in, say, Orange County or wherever that might be. But, yeah, we can look for that data and see if we have that breakdown by county.
And that would include the sweep. I mean, we always get a sweep every year, too, so we need to.
It would
either-
include whatever goes into the trust fund.
Yeah, it would go into the trust fund, but then how do you proportionally figure out what should come out after we have the sweep out of the
What
trust?
do you mean, what should come out?
Well, I mean, we will put 400 million into the trust fund, but we're capped at 273, or we're capped at, or we're only allocated 190 million. Does that am I not doing the math right there?
I don't really know what you mean. I thought what she
No,
was simply
I-
asking for was
And I'm
the
asking-
amount of
Right.
dock stamp funds from each county flowing into the trust funds over time. I don't think I need to worry
About
about
the
the.
sweep, 'cause
And
it's
each
that
county
last-
can
okay.
find and get their
Okay,
own, because I
okay.
have our own of what we have put in. I
Uh-huh.
just don't have a comparative, and I'm just wondering if there is one that we
Yeah, I
could
think
look
to get
at,
what
that's
Hannah
all.
was getting at, if you just do, and I'm so making this up, but if over the course of time or whatever period you pull, 27% of the trust funds got swept, you can just do 27% on every county reduction of, and none of you, this 27% didn't come back to you because they swept it into GR.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Right,
sorry.
right.
got-
You know,
thank
but
you.
Right.
like just a
But that's-
general percentage, I wouldn't go crazy on fine tuning to the
Yeah,
penny.
yeah.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would just ask if I can just explain this just a little bit further, because this isn't just a forecast of 10 years. What the whole purpose of putting this study together and having this study done was to be able to walk in, because all of us around this table and every person we've heard in the past 2 meetings, we go in and we constantly say fully fund. What this report and why we invested so much in this was because of the fact that we wanted to prove the economic impact and a positive on what this has done. So we're not just walking in a crisis mode, if you will, saying we need, but going in and thanking our legislators and turning around, most importantly, and saying, here's what this program has done for our communities. We also have this broken out, down by district, by county, of very specific data. If any of you want that, we can get that supplied to you, and it's a very thick document. This is just the executive summary. But I just wanted to elaborate that the reason for this was for the economic impact that it has done for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Other questions, comments in regards to Sadowski Act? Okay. Shall we move to,
Five. Yeah, that's fine.
do we want to talk a little bit about any other work group discussion about this and the next steps here? Any other questions? Okay.
That might be the best to do, yeah, since we know we have at least one person leaving early.
Okay. Are we moving to we're moving to the format of the work group final report?
Okay. So, behind tab 1, I think it's the last item in tab 1. Again, Mayor Messam suggested, I think what he said was, at the last meeting, let's begin to talk about the proposed format for the final report. I think he also added that there's so much we could recommend, we need to start to focus. Well, I will just say to you that this format is not that. It's not a focus in, because I am not the decider here of what the recommendations are. You all are. Well, it's a format. It's a format. So, we can do this however you all want to do it. My sense as the staff is that, your charge from the legislature should be covered, in the report. If there are other things that you all think are important to talk about, we can certainly fit them in or develop sections for them. A lot of this is just probably pretty obvious. It seems like, finding a way to summarize, not a 100-page document, but summarize the need, which was asked for. Part of the charge was to talk about market rate housing, the market for assisted rental housing, et cetera, to sort of talk about that. And that sort of potentially sets up the rest of the charge, which is the land use, the building codes. The state implementation of the low-income housing tax credit is the way the bill language was. Before, I think we encouraged you all to think about this in context with rental programs administered by Florida Housing, because the tax credit is, we don't think about it, by itself. And then, any appendices. So I'm not sure what you all want to do about this. If it may be you may think, okay, it's a reasonable structure until we start to, feed some recommendations in, and then we'll see if it works for us, right?
Any comments on that? Everybody seem amenable? I know Mayor Messam couldn't make it today, so
Right.
he
But
he
he
may
got
have
the
some
package.
comments at the next
He
meeting,
got the
but
package,
yeah.
yeah, that's right.
So I think overall, and I do think this probably will tweak a little bit as once we get into specifics, because they always do.
Right.
But I mean, it makes sense to me from who's the audience and what are we trying, what were we asked to do? And then, reporting it back in the way that they requested. It seems like a very logical, layout format to me, but we'll see once we start talking about ideas, so.
Right. Okay. All right, great.
Public comment.
And I guess we're moving on to public comments from the audience and here today. Would invite anyone who would like to make public comment to the work group to come forward.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members, distinguished members of this task force. My name is Willie Logan. I'm the CEO of the Opelika Community Development Corporation. But today I'm here as a board member of the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce and the chair of the subcommittee on the chair of the Housing Committee Subcommittee on Government. I will reserve our recommendations as regards to your work until our meeting in Miami on October 30th. But I first would like to thank the governor and the legislature for the wisdom of creating this task force. The urgency in dealing with affordable housing and workforce housing in Florida cannot wait another day. And so even though you have a very short period of time to come up with these recommendations, we think it's absolutely necessary, and thank you for your willingness to serve on this. I feel like the elephant in the room, and I've heard it amongst the members of the committee, is the Sadowski Fund. And having chaired the Finance and Tax Committee when this bill moved through the House, I recognize that it was the intent, it was the commitment to name it after the former Secretary of the Department of Community Affairs, because housing was needed to be addressed in the 90s, and it certainly needs to be addressed now, and would hope that if nothing else is done, that the recommendation of fully funding the Sadowski Act is foremost and broad and center in your recommendations. We also recognize that even within municipalities, better yet, county governments and state governments, that there's no one size fit all. You can't develop a policy that's going to work on Brickell and the same policy work in Liberty City, better yet, throughout various counties throughout the state. So you have quite a task before you, but one that from hearing over the past 2 meetings, you certainly are up to that task. And we will reserve further comments into the meeting on October 30th, but I just would like to acknowledge and thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Logan. Appreciate that. Okay, any further comments? Wow, yes. What is the location of the Miami meeting? Yes, okay.
Marriott Airport, but we're not done, folks. You can't go yet.
Yeah.
Okay, right. But it's at the Marriott Airport.
Okay, well, we can move past public comment to additional issues and the next steps. Are there any additional?
Can I say
Yep,
something?
Yep, I'm sorry, go ahead, Nancy.
So the third meeting out of 4, ideally, going into the third meeting, there may be additional issues to talk about that weren't on the table today. But in addition to that, if there are things that you've started to see, coming out of the discussion that kind of either keep coming up, or you individually have, there was some stuff on impact fees and the like, it is time to start telling me about those things, because I've got to start developing something that you can react to. I suspect there may be 1 or 2 recommendations that are pretty easy, but other ones that are going to be, if we're going to make a recommendation, we need context that I need to write and that you're going to need to respond to. So what I'd like to be able to walk away with today is not only what additional things you want to spend a little time on next time that you want to, we've only touched the surface with our panels today. But if we're moving in the direction, in which case you may need to argue amongst yourselves, and I'll take notes, related, any of it, impact fees, whatever, I would love to begin to pull some of that in.
So the one thing that I would like to have a little bit more clarity on, because this just is not my area of expertise, is the impact fees and a few other things came up where there's overarching rules, for lack of a better word, that the state imposes, and then there's a lot of local choice within those. I don't know where the line is on impact. I don't really understand how that rolls. I just know they're expensive. So what does the state have within its authority, or what is it mandating right now, so that we can, if we do have a recommendation of something the state could do differently, I'd like to know what it's doing now and what its purview within that is. I don't necessarily need a deep dive on it, but I personally don't know enough of what the state can do and actually is doing to make a recommendation as to what it might be able to do differently to help affordable housing.
Okay. Senator Rich?
Thank you. I just, if we're going to delve into impact fees that affect schools, I believe we better have some school board members here and people who understand the impact on the education of our children. We sitting here to say, well, maybe we should just get rid of impact fees. The boards, as was mentioned before, many different counties, different things going on, and some counties depend heavily on the impact fees, and they're very important for them. So I would not like to see us arbitrarily, make any kind of a decision. We need to have.
I'm not saying that I'm recommending one way or the other.
No,
I
but
don't even
even-
know what we're allowed to recommend.
I think it's an understanding of it, but I think my idea or vision is as much flexibility as possible. And when we got in this conversation about a lottery, that just makes me nervous.
Yeah,
that
right.
decisions are being made based on the ping pong ball. But if you could do a ranking, maybe it is taking into consideration a project that has partnered with a school board and a county on these impact fees. It's a weighted system as opposed to a lottery. That's kind of, I think, the direction we would maybe look at, not a waiving of all impact fees. I mean, that you're just kicking another can. That's what I think, getting a real understanding of how it works. If you're going to tweak the lottery, that's the type of thing you should do.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to
Mark?
add, and it seems like impact fees aren't the only option either. It seems like it always has to be impact. Well, there are other options out there. Is there something that is more reasonable for affordable housing that could be tailored differently than we have now, that's more attractive to the local governments to use? So it's more information about what the other options are besides impact fees, I think might be helpful too.
Yeah, and just to add to Mark's, if you look at the historical aspects of the Sadowski Act, the different years it swept at different levels. That's the world we live in, right? And so how do you work with maybe a smaller pie, but you give as many options as you possibly can on what to do with those funds? Like that would be how I would look at it as, yes, we want more money in affordable housing, but if that's not going to happen, giving everybody as much opportunity to do what they need to for their community. That's how I would look at it.
But it is happening, and this is the point. Each individual school district they're doing different things. Broward School District right now is looking at putting more money into affordable housing through their own funds. So, there are certain ones who realize that just looking at from their own teachers, just their own teacher base, they know they need to have more affordable housing. So I'm just saying, again, the flexibility is a good word. I mean, let's not come in there and be telling school districts what they, should or shouldn't be doing. Let's help them maybe, create some flexibility.
Well, I would argue that
Yeah.
in that example you just gave, the school district should be rewarded
Yeah, that's,
for doing
And-
that.
right.
And we should encourage that. That
That's
would be
fine.
my point.
Well, and maybe if we could just even, as part of this conversation amongst ourselves, my impression, and I could be totally wrong, but from this meeting and the prior meeting, is as a group, collectively, we're mostly interested in finding out what are things we can either incentivize or reward. We're not looking for mandates and punitive punishments for non-action. So, and maybe we just need to make sure we're all on the same page, and then if we're not, that's fine, we can have a conversation around that if somebody thinks we really need to, no, we have to make them do this, and I'm just, whatever. I mean, that's the impression I have. It's more about identifying where can we provide more options, and where do we want to either reward an example like that, or incentivize if they're not doing it, but we really think that the state should be trying to encourage this in a way that impacts the increase in affordable housing. But that's my impression, and I may be wrong.
I mean, I'll speak from, my position as chair. I like the incentive idea rather than the, hammer.
Yeah, and rewarding, if
they're doing Right.
it on their own without having been incentivized.
Recommending incentives rather than, what punishments. Anybody else out here? Okay.
So that was on impact fees, that kind of went off, but it was mainly on impact. Right, but, so I can only develop recommendations out of what you decide, that you've been talking about, that you've been hearing about is important. If you want me to bring you more information, I have culled a lot of information for you, but I am not at the point anymore where I've got like lists of things that I've just been holding back, and I'm, ready to sort of trot out if you ask for it, right? So this is the point when you either have to ask me for more information on a particular thing you've heard about but you don't know enough about, like you asked about the impact fee stuff, so that then we could have I think, an intelligent conversation about it. What else have you heard that you either need more information on, or you want us to start to think about what could the recommendation be around that?
I thought along the lines of providing incentives. Are there incentives that other states have that we haven't considered to give more options, to get to this, getting to a lottery issue where it's all decided by ping pong ball?
Okay,
Now,
so
if
you're
that's-
talking about the scoring process that Florida Housing uses?
Right, the scoring
That
process itself.
specifically, okay.
And are there ways
Great,
to,
okay.
sorry, two different things, I think two different things, actually. One is the scoring process that gets to the lottery, and is there a way to make that a better process? And from what I've been hearing from the meetings, there are, local governments are talking about different things they do. Like Manatee said, they incent for putting a development near transit, and maybe everybody does that. But are there things that we could recommend on a statewide basis that could be part of the conversation that the legislature would look at, that might add to the score, apply to the scoring in some way?
Or
that
you
if they
could
do
simply
that,
recommend that Florida Housing implement something,
or something
right?
like that,
Yeah,
right?
doesn't
Some way to
necessarily
look
have
at
to be a
things like
statutory.
along those lines.
Uh-huh. So you're saying that you want, what you want, and it sounds like Senator Gardner said something similar, you want to look more at the lottery and getting rid of the lottery, or
I don't know.
minimizing the use of lottery.
I think it needs to be examined. I don't have an
Okay.
opinion yet one way or the other, but
Okay.
it certainly needs to be
Oh,
looked
okay.
at, yeah.
So you want to know more about kind of how it comes, right, so it sounds like more education
Because
first.
it feels like everything goes the way it's supposed to go, and then you get to the lottery. And then it's like, okay, everybody did everything they were supposed to do and put all this time into it, and then
Okay.
it's down to the
I
lottery.
think
Yeah,
I
but-
think I have clarity on
But,
what you're seeking.
but there's one other portion to it, and that has to do with the nonprofits. And we said that there's an unfairness to it, not only just, people doing 10 things and paying, I think, former Representative Logan said something to me about $75,000 a pop for creating one of these. I mean, and it just creates an unfair burden to a nonprofit, to maybe a smaller county, smaller city, that the developer just can't do that. So I think that's equally as important as just this idea of, trying to pick, 10 plans that all are pretty similar, and, and not having kind of an understanding about how to rank them better.
Well, Nancy, Nancy and I
achieve what we
can
want, yeah.
work on this back at the office, but, it might be a good idea for you all to actually see an RFA.
Oh, that sounds really painful.
Yeah.
We'll figure out a way to
We'll-
provide information, probably not giving them a 75-page RFA.
140.
Right, right.
Mr. Chair.
But my. I don't have to fill it out. Right, but my thoughts are, so, or at least what information that, some of the things that we, ask for developers to do, so that you all are aware of what those criteria are.
Yes, I
So,
think that's right.
yeah. So, Holly?
I think that's a great idea, you know, and I don't want to seem like I'm kicking the can on this issue, but, you know, how Florida Housing allocates its funding is very complex. I mean, how many hours do we spend looking at every single RFA that comes out? So perhaps, you know, in that regard, it's more of a maybe further exploration or a partnership between Florida Housing and the development community and others on how can it be changed in these certain areas.
Right, sounds like what you're saying is, it may end up that the work group doesn't have the exact perfect solutions.
Correct.
But it gives some examples of what other states are doing and directs Florida Housing to, or
Consider.
strongly recommends Florida Housing change the process so that it's not as reliant on lottery, something like that. Well, we'll work really hard to figure out a way to try to educate you all so that you're not just killed by information, so that we can, all of you can talk more
Yeah.
thoughtfully about this at the next meeting.
2 points. One is on this subject of the lottery and the requirements that a developer needs to present in order to be competitive in the 9% competitive round. For example, it's not just $10,000 or $75,000. It's also signing a personal guarantee. I don't know any nonprofit board of directors who's going to sign a personal guarantee. That doesn't happen. That's why all of the proposals are from for-profit folks who've got the pockets to do that. You have? Well,
You sign personally?
my-
No, then, yeah, nonprofits don't sign personally, Jack. Yeah, they sign a
They sign a
comp, but,
guarantee.
all
yeah.
right, well,
So
my
what you,
board
so
won't do
Jack,
it.
what you're asking for, it sounds like, is to have some additional information, not just about the scoring, but also what the requirements are for, like, developer experience.
Well,
and-
yeah, at least in some outline fashion.
Yes,
But
yes.
corporate guarantee, I don't know that my board would sign that either. So,
you're not going to get an investor without it, so, yeah.
right, right.
Are we talking about things, making things more level playing field for the nonprofits? Is that what you're?
Well, that's what,
talking
yeah,
about?
that's the issue. So that was one thing. The other thing, we've talked about the incentives, and under tab 3 is an analysis of the AHAC incentives that local governments are currently required to look at every 3 years. And I'm just looking at, 51 responses, and there are a number where there are 2 or 3 that actually use those incentives. And so I think that's enlightening to look at that, and that chart that's within there that shows the numbers of, who's using increased density, who's using infrastructure capacity adjustments as incentives for affordable housing.
I found that chart really
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a
It's right before the
helpful-
color page.
Yeah, sorry, they're not. What,
It's the first page after tab 3.
It's.
no, it's in the middle.
No, it's in the middle of
It's
tab
before the
3, right before
transportation
the
and housing.
heavy
before
load.
the color pages, yeah. Anyway, I found that enlightening as we look at incentives. I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to it.
Yeah, that's,
We spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do we measure what local governments are doing in terms of incentives? And to be clear, if one of these general kinds, this list across the top and the column headers, those things may be done and not be included in the local housing assistance plan, but this was the only way I could figure out in a reasonable amount of time to do an inventory by comparing what those affordable housing committees were recommending and then what was ending up in the local housing assistance plan. It gives you information, and yet I don't know how useful it is, but I'm happy to do more with this if you see that there's something more that I can do within a month, basically. So whatever you'd like.
There were 2 other things that occurred to me from today's meeting. One was on the special needs developments, the question about the numbers. Is there anything that needs to be looked at further on that, or is that a flexible number already? I couldn't get the fine point on the end of that conversation of the size of the project for special needs. Is that a flexible thing that? Is there an
Yes.
issue there?
I
or-
mean, the main thing is that Florida Housing disincentivizes large projects, large meaning like over 80. We haven't said you can do no more than 80, I don't think, but we've worked with folks who know a lot about it, who are doing the work out there.
different
and-
RFAs, they kind of target different ranges
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to be sure we weren't leaving something on the table that,
I don't
that
think so.
needed to talk about.
Housing Coalition hasn't seen any issue in that regard.
Okay. Thank you.
Good.
And the other issue was the zoning was discussed and how that, there are certain challenges where if they don't want to change their zoning laws, there's nothing you can really do about it. Is there other methods that could be used to help the developer challenge that decision where there are, clear needs? Is there a method they could utilize that we don't currently have in place, other states, or some mechanism to try and overcome the NIMBYism, so to speak, with a
I
way
have
to
not,
challenge that?
I do not know of anything in any other state. The thing I do know about that other states have is more related to permitting and approvals, where if a local government refuses, I think maybe it was, I don't remember whether it was Mitchell or, okay, talked about like Massachusetts, right? Where if the local government, less than 10% of its housing is affordable, that it has the opportunity, or that the state law kicks in, where if they keep refusing new affordable housing properties, and this was more permitting and approvals like that versus zoning, then it goes to a state body.
And I know they talked about that time is money, but I'd be, I think that'd be interesting to, if there is more conversation to be had there. I think that seems to be a real choke point in the development of affordable housing, because it all stops right there if you can't overcome that.
And
issue.
when Mark was mentioning that, I thought that was really good, because yes, if you actually have to go through that process, it takes longer, but if they know they're going to have to go through that process and probably lose, they might just concede an issue, and it doesn't become a time is money issue, so there is that as well. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea.
Cheryl?
So over the past 2 meetings, we really haven't had any conversation on surplus lands that the local government has, which the allocation of surplus lands is for affordable housing, and the zoning conflicts as well that are happening where, and I can use my county as an example, where there's a large parcel, but the zoning would not permit me to be able to do a multi-unit. There's been no conversation over the past 2 meetings on that, and whether or not, and it's amazing to me in my own community and in other communities, when you mention surplus land, nobody's heard of it and didn't realize what it's meant for. So I just wanted to bring that up because we still have not mentioned it once. Thanks.
What would you imagine, I'm unsure of how I could create a conversation around that for
Well,
you.
I think we need to understand, does everyone here understand surplus land? And then what is the true conflicts that we're experiencing? And what are our developers experiencing? And I can say that I've had 2 developers approach in Citrus County, and it's been 100% land, where we could have adjusted and gone through the whole zoning, which now I have commissioners involved in on a local level, to do that would accommodate in my community age in place. And so, yet, we're stuck with zoning. So I don't know how, I'm just bringing it up that it hasn't been a subject line mentioned in the past 2 meetings, and it is something that maybe we need to look at, because that is a constitutional statute as well on surplus land. And yet, I can honestly say that I know of certain governments that are local governments that are actually saying we're going to sell the land and put it back into our general fund.
Okay. I think we can get some more information about that and talk about that next time.
So I'm back to the flexibility, and even though I realize, Nancy, that most of the governments use their SHIP, local governments use their SHIP money for homeownership. I do like the idea of having flexibility, because there are larger and medium counties that do get larger amounts of SHIP money that could potentially use more for rental if they had the flexibility to do that. You know, they don't have to, but it gives folks, back to this flexibility discussion, the ability to do that as opposed to restricting how they can use that funding. The other thing, and I realize that, you know, talking about full funding Sadowski, is a challenging discussion, but I do think particularly this year where we have just been hit, the whole state by Irma, we don't know, at least I haven't seen any statistics truly coming out yet of the impact on our housing stock. I've certainly seen it in the Keys, but I do think we need to think about that particularly for this year, and think about hurricane housing or replacing this housing stock that we've lost. Back to the Keys, it is their workforce housing that really took the hit down there. And so we do need to think about that and think about the recommendations around that, and then just our general need in this state and the need as our population is aging with very limited money in retirement. We're going to hit a much more serious housing crisis with our seniors if we are not talking about full funding or getting more money out there right now. So.
Con, I have a question for you on the use of SHIP for rental, and it's for the work group, because I've seen a few of you nodding about that and all, and our at least one representative representing the home builders had to leave, but I know that the alliance of folks who got together in '92 to advocate for the Sadowski programs and the trust funds, the reason that the SHIP goal is the way that it is because I believe the realtors and the home builders were, pretty adamant about, they wanted to make sure that all the money wasn't going for rental housing. So if we think about a further discussion about honing a recommendation related to the flexibility of SHIP, how do you, I know we always have to think about politics and interest groups and all of that. So I don't know if, I can certainly, Cheryl, you have been fairly quiet about that, representing the realtors, and Doug Buck left. He was here earlier. So I don't know, do we bring folks in to talk about that, and so that you can see kind of where they're at these days? Or, home builders don't just represent single-family homeownership.
And actually, as I was saying that, I was thinking about that in the back of my mind. I do think we've also got a very different market in terms of what our rental and home ownership focus was in the early 90s as opposed to where our market is now. I do think as a recommendation, and I think you're right, that we do need to have some understanding of will the realtors support this, because it does us no good to send a recommendation into the legislature and just not have the support behind it. But we're certainly hearing it from the local governments, and I don't think in the larger scheme of things it's going to make a huge amount of difference. I don't think it's going to change the fact that we've got most of, 85% of our money going to homeownership. It just gives us a little more flexibility in terms of the changing markets and what we do.
So I will chime in, so. It's not that realtors don't want to see rentals and so on. I will be honest with you, straight across the board, whether it's the rental community, whether it is single-family residency, whether it's condominiums, townhomes, there is a shortage in this state, period. And so our goal would be, as realtors, is we are fighting for home ownership rights. We are fighting for home ownership. And so there's stages to that home ownership. And in some cases, it's starting with rental. In some cases, it's homeless getting into housing, temporary housing, and working their way up. I work primarily in this area. And so I work with many people who, and along with many realtors, with counselors and getting them credit ready, not to make the sale, but we want everyone to have the same American dream. And so that would be my position, and I would continue to do that. And that is why we did this economic study, was to show the importance, whether it was rentals, whether it was home ownership, the economic impact to your area for legislation purposes was that it created jobs, it added more citizens, it gave stability, and so on. So I think we can have this conversation and much deeper on the flexibility, but I think in LHAPs, it goes back down to a local government. I can honestly say I sit on my AHAC committee for my county, and this was the first year that it was put back in for down payment assistance. It has not been for many years. So we could definitely have that conversation.
Thank you. Other thoughts, moving ahead to the next meeting for discussion? Holly?
Yeah, I actually have a suggestion of something we could look into further on zoning and as it relates to preservation. Over time, zoning changes and a lot of the older buildings become legally nonconforming. And, in a market rate environment, that's not an issue. Okay, you're going to get insurance. But in a tax credit environment, that is an issue. And it presents an issue for the developer when they go in and are, buying a legally nonconforming building to do a rehab on, because they're at risk that the local government, if there is a, destruction of 50% or more of a building, or however the local government's plan reads, that they won't be able to rebuild, and they lost their tax credits. I've heard, I haven't seen it, but I have heard that other states have, some of their localities have automatic waivers of that for affordable housing projects, so that they will, you have an event, you will be able to rebuild. It's a small, suggestion, but I think it's definitely an issue, especially as we're going to see the housing stock in the state age, that could facilitate the preservation.
Okay, thank you, Holly. Further discussion?
I have a
Nancy?
What do you want to do with the Sadowski information provided? I'm not talking about necessarily recommendations. Do you want some of this information in a final report? Do you want a report on the performance? Somebody came up with that and said, let's look at that. That doesn't mean we necessarily put it in the report. What are your thoughts about it? We didn't really have any discussion
Yeah,
on
I
it.
think it's a foregone that we're going to recommend full funding, so
No, I wouldn't.
we could take a vote on that one now. So, there will be something about Sadowski in the report, because it will be one of the recommendations. And I did the math. This is the 25th anniversary, and by the way, nobody's touting that this is the 25th anniversary if it was created in '92.
The Florida Housing Coalition is.
Okay, well, I'm not hearing it
Of course.
outside of their voice, because how many units, what has it done, the economic impact? Because again, going back to what it has accomplished demonstrates its importance, and using it for its intended purpose might be a good place to kind of just, highlight why we're making that recommendation.
I agree, and, there's been comments about certain issues with some HUD housing, and I think it's very important for us to show how effective this program has been, and that we've been accountable for our money, and we've, really done a good job, and we could have done a lot better job if we had more money. So, give them both sides of it.
Is there
Well,
other?
yeah, and just highlighting the leveraging too. I mean, it's incredible.
Is it good enough to just tell the legislature, this is how much money we've spent, this is how many units we've built, this is the leveraging? Because this is all this basically is in this meeting package.
Will the jobs number be hard to put together? Because I do think the jobs number is,
No, I don't think that's hard to put together. It's in the packet.
Yes, it's hard to put together.
yeah, I
Yes.
think it is.
Yeah, over the whole time, the jobs
Oh, yeah.
numbers would be hard to put
Oh, I
together.
see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could we do
For all
one
programs.
year, or a snapshot,
Well,
or a,
Florida Housing does economic impact stuff every year, and
Right.
we do, we separate out the programs. It overlaps, though, because, if you use
I know.
your housing credits with your sale, then but anyway, so we could certainly do a couple of years of showing that. I don't know how useful that is.
Yeah, I
And we can
just- I
also,
mean-
you know,
Oh, it's actually already done. If you,
well, for 10 years.
and
So I'm
it's
just
it's
making
over
sure
10 years, so if you
So
were just
what you, 10
saying
years would be,
a couple.
For just ship and sale.
yeah, I think that would be okay.
And this
I
is
mean,
broken out by county. And again, I think we did supply Nancy with this full
Oh,
report.
yes, uh-huh.
And broken out by county. So I believe she has access to it, and it's probably out on the
Yeah,
website.
I don't think reinventing the wheel, but if there's data out
Okay.
there, the job stuff is just really,
Yeah, because if
Really
you have the
telling.
data on the jobs for the trust funds, which is what this particular recommendation is about, and then Florida Housing has the leveraging information, they can talk about the leverage, and you can combine some of these tables into a very compelling, high and best use of resources.
Trey, as the governor's appointee to the board, I think it would be fair for me to say I don't have an opinion on anything yet. This is all examining these issues. Because there's been conversation about it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to do one thing or another, to be fair, I haven't opined on anything yet, not saying we will one way or the other, yes or no, but I need to say that for the record. Thank you.
Well said.
And I would add a little bit to that, because I'm looking at the work group recommendation must include but not limited to. And I just would caution will fully fund, because as somebody who had served a long time, that can immediately just discredit what you're bringing forward. I would be very, like, I envision this, is what we're doing policy-wise working? What can we tweak on the policy side? And the funding side will work itself out. Each individual person can go talk about that. I was more interested in the underlying, so I'd be cautious, because I think we could discredit ourselves if that's immediately, well, we just need more money. Just be careful.
Say thing. I totally agree about the fully funding, that kind of wording. But I have to say, but I knew you were, so, but I have to say that there is no way to solve this problem unless we have more resources, unless we have more money to build, rental, single family, all the things that ship, sale, that Florida Housing does. So to me, I mean, it has to be a component of this. It just, then we're not going to solve the problem. And the idea is the recommendations to make things better and to help solve this crisis in our state. It is a crisis. So I feel like we have to
the
put something
conversation
in.
is more, we realize that resources are needed, and here's the impact of the resources that we've had, and if we want to go forward, as opposed to a dollar, I'd love to put a dollar amount in it, but I absolutely hear what you're saying, is that, we realize this is a resource issue, and, there are things that we can do policy-wise to make recommendations to better serve our residents, of the state with the resources that we have. And then the list of policy recommendations under, because, for me, housing is a math problem. And while it looks like it's a construction problem, and when we get to construction, it's always a problem, but it's really a math problem. And it is about resources, and there are things we can do around impact fees and zoning and that kind of stuff that bring the amount of resources down that we need, but it is a resource issue, so. But maybe it's that kind of conversation as opposed to, so.
Okay, well, it looks like we have got some direction for our third meeting, and we will,
Hey, we might have consensus on one issue, which is building codes. I literally do not want to touch our building codes or do anything that reduces them for affordable housing. I think our properties in the Keys are testament to our building codes. Our residents can move into their units, that we had a lot of them evacuate, they can move back in, they have a house. And it's a testament to those building codes. So I really want to make sure, at least from my side, that we don't touch those building codes or have recommendations that lessen those codes.
Thank you. I don't foresee them coming from this position, that's for sure. Maybe we can simply that we can wrap that one up pretty early on our last meeting about what we would recommend, which may even be something to, that is a statement about that they should absolutely remain the same. That's my thought. We can have that discussion in
Trey.
November.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
No, I was
Shannon?
going to ask a question, mostly to Nancy, because she's got a lot to do in 1 month. So I guess, and you don't have to answer it at this moment, but please feel free to get back to each of us. What do you need from us? Because you've got a lot to get done in the next month so that we can have the fruitful conversation that we need to have. And I'm sure as you start to, so, just tell us what you need us to provide to you from what is it we're thinking, what have we heard? Did you hear this, or whatever the scenario may be, because 1 month from now is not a long time.
Right.
Okay.
Well, we will, Nancy will be in touch, and with, because I can't be in touch, we don't talk. We don't talk outside these meetings, so I don't talk to you about the agenda, so. But Nancy will be in touch. We will reconvene in Miami on October 30th at 10 a.m. We'll plan to meet most of the day through 6 p.m. We might be able to, we'll see if the time was allotted as it was today. We turned out a little early, but appreciate all the work group's efforts, and look forward to seeing you in Miami next month. Thank you so much. We're adjourned.